Hey guys, hope you're doing well. Hope you're staying safe, and I hope you guys are finding ways to stay entertained, to keep busy during quarantine, during social distancing. So you guys, you know how there are things that look easy, appear easy, sound easy, whatever, but it turns out that they're actually pretty difficult. Like the thing that we are in right now, social distancing, quarantine, I feel like that's kind of maybe one of those things. Like for me, I thought weeks back before this was something that we were required to do, I was like, oh, it's not going to be that difficult. It looks like it's going that way, and I'll be fine. Like that won't be too challenging. Like I'll get to spend time with my wife. I'll get to spend time with the new puppy who's napping right now, as almost always, unless he's running around like crazy. There's plenty of stuff to do. I'll be fine. But man, it's actually turning out to be difficult. Don't get me wrong, it's definitely not the most difficult thing in the world. There are so many more difficult things, so many more challenging things, but it's not as easy as I expected it to be. For me, I'm kind of weird. Like after a few episodes of TV, I'm done. I'm like, I gotta do something else. Like, I know that's weird. Like, don't judge me, but that's one thing that's kind of difficult. Like, I can't just sit and just watch a ton of TV because I get bored of the thing that's trying to keep me from being bored. And like another thing is like our climbing gym's closed, like the exercise centers are closed, and so I'm not able to work out. So that's difficult and challenging. And then because of that, like diet, it's like, oh, that goes out the window. And so that's challenging. That's difficult for me. And then I find myself like wanting to get out and get a change of scenery. I'm like, okay, I've seen that bookshelf like 450 times today. I want to look at something else, please. But I don't have that option. And that's tough. And I thought it wouldn't be a struggle, but it kind of is. Maybe some of you guys are in that same boat. Maybe some of you guys aren't so much in that same boat. But no matter what, whether we're experiencing that or not experiencing that in the same way, we've all experienced things in our life that we realize are harder than we expected them to be. They're harder than they looked, harder than they sounded. And one of the things that is harder than it sounds that I want to talk about tonight is forgiveness. We all understand, we get the idea of forgiveness, but actually forgiving someone in real life is not so easy. Because forgiveness is easy until you have to do it, until you have to practice it. And Jesus knew that even if we understood the idea of forgiveness, even if we got it, we would still struggle to do it. The good news, though, is that he hasn't asked us to do anything that he wasn't willing to do himself. He sets an example for us. And so we're going to look at a parable, a story about forgiveness in Matthew 18. This is our last week in this series, The Storyteller, where we look at different parables, stories that Jesus tells in order to demonstrate a point, to teach. And so a little context leading up to this parable, Peter, one of the 12 disciples, asks Jesus a question about forgiveness. So he says this in Matthew 18, verse 21. Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? So Peter was aware that forgiveness was difficult, and this is why he's asking just how much is required of him. Peter asked, can I stop after 7 times? Is that good enough? And when you understand the context of the Jewish law that Peter was under, 7 times actually goes above and beyond what was expected. And so you can imagine Peter's surprise when Jesus responds by saying this in verse 22. I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Okay, so once you've forgiven 77 times, you're good to go, you're off the hook, you never need to forgive again. No. Jesus isn't saying that. He's not saying a literal 77 times. He had something much bigger in mind that he wanted to teach, and that's why he tells us this parable that we're about to look at. He tells this story to demonstrate forgiveness. And so in verse 23, he goes on to say, therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. "Be patient with me," he begged, "and I'll pay everything back." The servant's master took pity on him and canceled the debt and let him go. So 10,000 bags of gold. Maybe I don't need to tell you this, but that's a lot of moolah. Like, that's like millions of dollars today. He's got buku bucks that he owes this guy. And people listening to the story got that. Just like hopefully you hear 10,000 bags of gold and your mind doesn't go like, nah, chump change. You probably hear that and you go, that's a lot. The people listening to this story, when Jesus is first telling it, they get that. They understand that. And so they're shocked when like this plot twist of like, yeah, I'll forgive it. I'll forgive this debt happens. For someone to get a break on money, that amount of money that they owed, like, you would expect them to be like incredibly grateful and to have this like life-changing event where it's like, my life is completely different now. But that's not the end of the story. Jesus goes on in this parable in verse 28, and he says this, "But when the servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins." And so, okay, what's going to happen here? Obviously, he's going to forgive that debt because his debt, which was much bigger, was forgiven. Obviously. But Jesus goes on with the story and says this, "He grabbed him and began to choke him. 'Pay back what you owe me,' he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, 'Be patient with me. I'll pay you back.' But he refused, and instead he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt." So, just because we understand what should happen with forgiveness doesn't mean that it's easy for us. Just because he saw what forgiveness looked like doesn't mean he actually had an easy time forgiving. And Jesus doesn't let us off the hook. This isn't just a story. There's application to it. Jesus doesn't let us off the hook because it's difficult to practice forgiveness. He goes on in verse 31 to say this, "When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. 'You wicked servant,' he said, 'I canceled all your debts because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had mercy on you?' In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. This man missed an opportunity to show small forgiveness immediately after he was shown this huge forgiveness." And then Jesus adds this like exclamation point, like this cherry on top to this parable, like the thing that is no longer a part of the story, but is like, yeah, if you missed the point. In 35, he says, "This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart." And so what does Jesus mean by this? What's he getting at? Like, remember, it's a parable, it's a story, and it doesn't mean you're literally going to be thrown in jail and tortured if you don't forgive. Refusing to forgive is its own kind of punishment and torture. Like, to go back to Peter's question, like, Jesus, how many times should I forgive? Like, is forgiving 7 times enough? Like, the point is not how many times do you have to forgive, but how many times can you forgive? Like, the point of this story is partly to shift our attention away from the wrong that was done to us, the debt that is owed to us, and towards the things that maybe we've done, the debt that we owed that was generously forgiven. When our eyes are opened to all the ways that we aren't perfect, to the shortcomings that we have, giving other people a break, forgiving other people becomes a lot easier. Forgive as you have been forgiven. And as long as we think we're better than someone else, and we haven't done as bad of things as they've done to us, as long as we're thinking that way, forgiveness will be a tough thing to demonstrate. It may even be an impossible thing to demonstrate. But as Jesus' story points out, it's all connected. Our ability to forgive others is directly tied to our willingness to receive forgiveness. For many of us in church, we have to remind ourselves that we're not as perfect, we're not as good as we sometimes think we are. Jesus has led the way in demonstrating the power of forgiveness, and we get to follow his lead. He forgave, and so we should forgive as well. Imagine this for a second. You can maybe even grab some pieces of paper and actually do this, but imagine you have two cards in front of you. One says, what I did to someone, and the other one says, what someone did to me. Like I said, maybe you can even write these things down. Think about it, pray about it. It doesn't have to be right now, it doesn't have to be tonight, it can be tomorrow, it can be later this week. What I did to someone and what someone did to me. What would those two things be? Have you received forgiveness for what you have done? And are you willing to offer forgiveness for what someone did to you? What you need to receive forgiveness for and what you need to give forgiveness for are connected. Freedom is found when you can give forgiveness because you receive it. So forgiveness is easy until you have to do it. A lot of the times it's not a one-time thing, because sometimes we have to forgive over and over and over again. In a perfect world, it would be like you forgive and you're good. That problem will never arise again. But that's just not the case. Sometimes we need to forgive over and over again. Sometimes our own sins need to be forgiven because we mess up again, and we mess up again. And that same sin that we did back here that was forgiven needs to be forgiven again here. The point of the story is this, that the story about bags of gold isn't just about us. It is absolutely about us and our need to forgive. But as with all of Jesus' stories, as with all of his parables, it tells us something about the storyteller, about Jesus himself. He tells this story to remind us that because of what he has done, we have more power than we can imagine to forgive other people.